Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Fun House, alongside, as always, Mr. Martin Popoff. Morning, Martin.
Yes. Morning, sir. Yes. Looking forward to this one. We've been kind of putting this one off. It's a little bit tricky, but it's a good topic on a nice invigorating fall morning here in Toronto and in New York, I imagine, right?
Yes, frost on the ground, but the
Yeah.
sun's out. It's going to be a nice day, a little chilly, but that's okay. We don't mind that too much. So, yeah,
Nice.
I am also looking forward to this. Yes, we have been putting it off for a few days, our recording schedule is a little bit strange over the last week or so because Martin's traveling, then I'm busy, and so we've been kind of doing these on off days from when we usually record them. But this one we did put off for a little bit, and I think because it's an interesting conversation, but it's one that I'm sure is going to be controversial to some people watching. This is can the old legends be surpassed? And this kind of came about from an episode we did not that long ago, and we had one of our viewers who felt very strongly about a part of the conversation that had to do with modern players versus the classic players, and how and Martin, I don't know if you want to get into the specifics of what this conversation was all about, but it basically had to do with the fact that someone, a respected member of a respected band, is no longer in that band. Can someone come in and fill their shoes and do it just as well? And there are people who feel that that is not the case, that you can never replace the personality of that original player. And there are a lot of other people who are like, well, anybody can play those notes, anybody can play those beats, whatever it is, sing the words, as long as they do it very competently and they pay respect to the original person, all is well. But not everybody agrees on this. This is a very hot topic and a very contentious topic with a lot of people, especially in a day and age where you have legacy bands who, either don't have any original members or half the original lineup is gone, and you got people coming in doing a fine job, but people won't accept the replacements, right? The replacement is never as good as the original. So we decided to do a whole show on this. So Martin, I don't know if you want to add anything before we kind of get started here.
Yeah, I guess this makes sense to bring up this quote. I'll leave it anonymous out of respect, but I mean, basically, I think it was a disagreement about boy, I'm not sure this was the Steve Jordan, Charlie Watts trouble I got into, sort of thing. Or, I've also mentioned this with respect to Jason Bonham and John Bonham, sort of thing. But I'll start with the quote, and yeah, to keep our thoughts at least a little bit organized. We have decided to split this up into five categories. To keep some focus as we move along here, but oddly enough, this category does it does refer to my first category, which is drums. So it goes, of course, I completely disagree vehemently with your premise. Sure, it's possible to copy someone else's sound style approach, but it's never going to match or surpass the original. Put any drummers that George loves, Mangini, Portnoy, Gavin Harrison, et al. Behind a drum kit, blindfolded me, and I'll blindfold me, and I'll never be able to tell the difference between them. Conversely, I know it's Ringo, Charlie, Bonzo, and many others from the first few beats. For me, it's the difference between virtuoso and innovator. Charlie brought his jazz influence into rock and roll to create a unique sound and approach to playing. The drums, Mangini, Portnoy, Harrison, et al., they all sound like a bunch of Peart wannabes to me. There's no soul or funk or emotion in their playing. It's all about technical skill and how fast they can do a fill. It leaves me cold. It's like musical pornography. It's all about speed and dexterity and size of the drum kit, and more is more attitude that appeals only to other musicians. There's a reason why all the concepts, okay, then I won't go into it because there's more names and name calling and all that kind of stuff. So every single point is brought up here about this. So, can the old legends be surpassed? So the idea here, and again, I'll try to stick to drummers here. I've always said that, it's the sports analogy is the big thing here, right? The idea that records are set and you respect those people for setting the records, but then records can be broken, right? So that's one aspect of it where we don't have to extol forever that the virtuosity skills of these old drummers, say to begin with. And I mean, let's add Neil Peart in there, but more so, we're talking about the likes of a Ginger Baker, the way people talk about Ginger Baker. But we don't have to stick with the idea that what they did is super hard and no one else can do it, sort of thing. But the most important thing to laud them for and respect them for is that they were out there being pioneers, setting records, doing amazing things, inspiring tons and tons of other drummers. So keep it to drummers here. I mean, no one has inspired more drummers than Neil Peart and John Bonham, I would say. But you could put in Ringo Starr, and you could put in Peter Criss, and you could put in Ginger Baker, and Mitch Mitchell, and all that kind of thing, right? But so that's one part of this as well. And the part where I really got into trouble was this comparing Charlie Watts to Steve Jordan, and then bringing in, these types of virtuosos. And I kind of make the point sometimes to be argumentative, but I believe it as well, is that Ringo Starr can't do Gavin Harrison, but Gavin Harrison could do Ringo Starr. If put the right kid in front of him, put those old recording values in front of him, tell him to think about it for a minute, and 5 minutes later, you would get a better Ringo Starr than a Ringo Starr. You'd get a better Peter Criss than a Peter Criss. You may be able to get you may be able to get a Charlie Watts that does more Charlie Watts like things than even a Charlie Watts, right? And then you could turn to him and say, too much? Is it, he could turn to the producer and say, was that too much? Yeah, take it back a bit. And he could take it back a bit in with no effort whatsoever and give you an exact Charlie Watts. And then, he could go to the producer and say, is it still too much? And the producer would say, yeah, take it back. We don't want them really comparing you to Charlie Watts. We just want them to maybe think a little bit that you can do a Charlie Watts. And then he'll give you that. So that's kind of the point. When we talked about titling this episode, we thought about using the word romanticizing in some way, right? Because I think that's what goes on with these old legends as well. I think we romanticize them to the point where we think we think that the old guys, like going into this Rush thing recently, this Rush news, and Getty talking about, oh, Alex and I could play again as this. And I see some of the Facebook comments saying, oh, you'd need two drummers to do what Neil did and stuff, right? And then I always get this guy's. I just did a little video on this, but the TikTok is a good place, and YouTube Shorts and Facebook Shorts is a good place to see these amazing technical guys. And there's, El Estepario Siberiano, the Groove Father, right? Jorge Garrido from Spain. And you watch those videos, and he's such an amazing technician. And one of his nice things that he likes to do these videos is play a super complex beat with one hand while sipping a cup of coffee, right? And, to be argumentative again, I said in some of these Facebook things, I think there are drummers out there, and I'm thinking of this guy, right? There are drummers out there who could play half the Rush set with one arm, right? And just to really drive home the point that I mean, stop it with this technical thing, right? And then people get really the wires crossed in a weird way, say, suggesting Carl Palmer, Stuart Copeland, right? Those are the wrong guys. Those are exactly the guys you don't think can replace them, because those guys have such distinct personalities to what they do, and the legend of what they put together, it doesn't particularly align with Rush. And then with Carl Palmer, I think he's one of the guys who couldn't go out there and do Neil Peart, even though he comes from the prog world, right? So, and Stuart Copeland probably could, but the style would feel all wrong. The weight of it would feel wrong, sort of thing. But a Mike Portnoy or a Gavin Harrison could do it, right? I'd say more of a Mike Portnoy, because you'd almost get too much of Gavin Harrison's personality in there. So so I think I'll stop there. But yeah, so basically, well, no, I'll mention one other thing. Let's just go down this route, because I had these out for props. The Jason Bonham Band, right? And here's a singer who is a young guy who, you could say, I could listen to that guy more than I can listen to Robert Plant and be entertained, right? This amazing Jason Bonham album, and then the earlier Bonham album. So yeah, when I'm in a feisty, argumentative mood, and this has been discussed recently as well, right? I could say things like, I've quipped that Jason's a better drummer than his dad was, right? But to be more sensible about it and less argumentative, I could say things like, and totally believe it, I could get more joy and interest and artistic inspiration from listening to one Black Country Communion album than I could from any given Led Zeppelin album. And I think that's a sensible comment to say. So again, the idea is So it's a different situation here where you've got the son, um, hugely inspired by the father, but there's no reason to think that that son can't take that inspiration to a whole nother place and be 125% of John Bonham, right? And that's kind of the idea, right? So I think we over romanticize the old guys. The new guys can do the old stuff and stop with this nonsense about these guys don't know how to groove. They don't have the groove, the heart, and the soul of those old guys. It would take them seconds to just sit down, take a deep breath, and say, "All right, I got to play behind the beat like Charlie Watts here," and they can deliver. So I'll stop there because, like I say, we've split it up a little bit by department.
Martin, how old approximately is Jason Bonham?
Oh boy, I would say 50 in that range, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I
Maybe
would think in his 50s,
yeah,
right?
that kind of thing, right? I remember he was a kid, but yeah, so he's now, see, that's the other thing. He's now of that senior contingent when, as I said on this Rush thing I did with the Contrarians, where the replacement people in these legendary bands, if you're going to replace, you want them to be 1.5 generations behind. You don't want a young kid in there. You want someone with some history and some resume. So Jason Bonham is another perfect guy that you would put forward to be in these legacy situations, as he has shown up in UFO and in Foreigner and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking like so Jason, let's say Jason's in his early 50s at this point.
Mhm.
John was how old when he died?
I'll try look Jason up here.
30.
32, something like that. I think maybe 30. Yeah.
So my point is that Jason's been playing probably since he was a kid, and now he's got 20 years of experience on top of like where his father left us to continue to add to his skill set, right?
He was born in 66, so he's 57 years old.
So he's the same age as I am. Okay. All right. So, so it's not unheard of to think that Jason Bonham has perfected his craft and his skills at the drum kit to maybe places that go a little bit above and beyond what his father was doing, because his father didn't have that time. As great as, I mean, we all love Bonham. I mean, we all love John, right? So and John was fortunate enough to play on all those great Led Zeppelin albums that we all romanticize, right? So now we're romanticizing albums as well as the musicians. So it's not unheard of to think that Jason Bonham has been able to take his skills to even farther places than his father did at the time. Whether you think that Jason doesn't groove enough as much as his father, yeah, that's up for another debate. But I think that the point is that when you have all those years behind you, and Jason's been busy. It's not like Jason's been sitting around. He keeps busy. He's been playing, he's been touring. So, to say that Jason Bonham's skills are, below his father's, I think when you really look at it, is probably not possible, right?
Yeah.
It's just, but again, his father has appeared on these classic beloved albums, and maybe Jason hasn't to that extent, right?
Yeah. And I'll also add, with John, he wrote in his head, he wrote some beautiful, beautiful music on the drums, right? So that's the thing. There's amazing parts that he did. So when we're talking about art, the subjective idea of art, subjective versus objective, he made some amazing, magnificent arts. Forget about breaking records. I mean, he broke a few records, but that's not really, this isn't Neil Peart's the guy you talk about breaking records. John Bonham is just wrote some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful music and art. And then on that gradated scale, as you get more abstract into the subjective, you talk about the beautiful art that Ringo Starr gave us, or Charlie Watts gave us, or even Peter Criss gave us, right? So that's the kind of different thing. But again, even on our artistic level, I can listen to like a single Black Country Communion song and go, it wouldn't be a crazy person talking to say, if I had to rank these, the 10 fills, there's probably 25 fills, on many different Black Country Communion songs. I could rate those fills, dovetail them in with all the top fills John Bonham ever did as well. So there's art. You can find art right there in that drumming just as much as you can find in John's art.
Yeah, and before we move on to bass playing, there's like so much to talk about here.
Mm-hmm.
Some people prefer simplicity over complexity, right? That's a reason why, something like prog rock or fusion is not looked at as highly as, blues rock, hard rock, metal, even, right? So the fondness for people like Ringo and Charlie and whatnot, because they are so simple and in the pocket, perfect for the song. There's always going to be a lot of people who are going to hold on near and dear to those guys over anybody else who plays remotely technical. That's just the way, I think, as a society, that's the way we think. And to go back to the whole sports thing that we talked about at the top of the hour, I look at it got me thinking of like baseball, right? So if you were someone who grew up in the 50s and 60s as a baseball fan, and you saw Roger Maris hitting 61 home runs, and Mickey Mantle and Babe Ruth and all those guys, right? You want those records to be immortalized and set in stone by those guys you grew up with watching forever. So when a guy like a Mark McGwire or Barry Bonds or Aaron Judge or whoever comes along, it's almost like you don't want those records to be broken, because again, we've romanticized those classic players, right? Who broke the record first. So it's like almost like, or who made those records, who set those records. It's like the record should always be immortalized forever and never broken because you were around to see them happen the first time. So I wonder how much of that is part of this whole thing. That it's like the ones that we experience making or breaking the records, we always want them to be those people.
Yeah. One other funny point I just want to bring up. I know I hope this will go 3 hours for you here, but you know, when people say, "Oh, what he served the song, what he did was perfect for the song," right? The first thing I think of is compared to what? We don't have a different version, right? If Phil Rudd had added a couple of fills in those AC/DC songs, how many of us would go, "Well, that's clearly better," right? I actually like this better, than when he did no fills, right? So that drives me a little crazy sometimes too. I mean, it is the song. It is literally, it's cast in stone. That amazing Beatles song is that Beatles song. There is no alternative. But it's like to say what Ringo did there was perfect. It's like you could listen to 10 more drum performances and have an exponential 10 times 10 number of opinions of well, actually, yeah, you're right, that is better, that is much more interesting, it's much more musical. I love that fill. Oh, that's a groovy fill. I love the way the cymbals sound on this version here by let's go with boy, I can't even think of a drummer's name.
Chad Smith.
Let's go. Yeah. Let's go with Bill Ward even, or whatever. Right. It's like, oh, I would love, oh, you're right. This birthday sounds way better with Bill Ward's, wall of sound cymbals all over it all of a sudden. Right. So anyways, I'll stop there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, you mentioned Bill Ward. So it's like, think about the whole Sabbath situation, how, Vinny Appice replaced him, and then you had Cozy Powell in there, all well-respected drummers. But there's a lot of people that still argue that the best guy, the best fit for Sabbath was always Bill Ward, because as great as the other guys were, they didn't have that deft little touch. And maybe they were a little too heavy-handed for Sabbath and whatnot. And it's like, but, Sabbath's music always needed a heavy hitter, but I think Bill brought these extra brushstrokes to the whole sound palette, which I think really worked, and people they're very tied to that. So yeah. All right. Anyway, we'll move on to, otherwise we'll spend the whole time talking about drummers here. So bass players, right? So this is really interesting. So before we started today, I was really thinking about how when we look at some of the great bass players of all time, they seem to come from a very, very specific era. And I've been thinking in more modern times, and it's almost like the bass virtuosos aren't discussed much anymore in rock. Okay. And I'll kind of back this up here a little bit. So we think of like some of the innovators, right? So of course we got Chris Squire from Yes. Geddy Lee from Rush, Paul McCartney, certainly, right? Jack Cassidy, John Entwistle, Tim Bogert, John Wetton, Jaco Pastorius, Stanley Clarke, Geezer Butler, John Paul Jones, over and over and over again. So what do they all have in common? These are all players that really came to prominence and made their mark on the music scene in the 70s. Okay. Going into the 80s, you look at like what was really popular in the 80s. So you got, new wave and pop music, metal, thrash metal, that sort of thing. More an era of guitar players, I think, and shredders and whatnot. Not a lot of focus on newer bass players coming up, save for maybe a couple, right? Billy Sheehan comes to mind. So he's the one guy that I think in the 80s came and took bass playing to a different level and maybe made it this kind of like acrobatic kind of gymnastic thing, kind of like what was going on with guitar. Could Billy Sheehan play and do anything that any of those older guys did? Arguably, and then some, right? Because a lot of people always thought that Billy had this kind of like guitarist mentality on the bass. And then you got later on, you got to get Steve Harris, right? That's another guy, right? Flea and Red Hot Chili Peppers. And then later on, you got, Robert Trujillo, John Mayung and Dream Theater, right? But again, these are folks who were respected for what they do and what they've done, but not given a lot of focus like some of the guys in the 70s for some reason. Maybe say for Steve Harris, I think, because Steve Harris was also the driving force in that band from a songwriting perspective and just the big brains behind Iron Maiden. But if you look at like nowadays, the guys and gals who are getting most of the attention in the bass world are playing in musical genres that aren't necessarily mainstream. So like if you go, and you mentioned earlier YouTube, you can go on YouTube and TikTok and you can see all these amazing kids playing all this crazy stuff on the bass and what have you. But most of the big musician buzz that we're seeing nowadays from bass players are more like prog and fusion players, right? More niche stuff, more especially instrumental things. We've seen like Tal Wilkenfield in more recent years, and she's played with Jeff Beck and lots of other people. And there's a whole slew of fusion players who are just absolutely brilliant and probably can do things leaps and bounds further technically than all the folks that I mentioned already, all the classic guard. But then if you look back at the classic players, I think when it comes to bass playing, Martin, maybe as opposed to drumming, I would argue that there was a lot of really technical bass playing in those golden years in the 70s, right? You look at some of the stuff that John Entwistle was doing in The Who in the 60s. I mean, he was playing bass solos in songs. I mean, who was doing that? Nobody was doing that. Geddy Lee, Chris Squire, both doing some really, really intricate stuff in all those classic Yes and Rush albums all throughout the 70s. Even McCartney had a lot of really, really technically impressive bass lines and grooves throughout a lot of those albums. So, but I still think that, and again, it goes back to this whole thing. It's like, I think if you are a professional musician, whether you are a drummer, bass player, keyboard player, guitarist, doesn't matter, you should be well-rounded enough where you can kind of tackle any kind of style at any tempo, regardless of what the music is. So I think your point earlier about someone being able to say, okay, I'm playing in a prog metal band, but I can sit back and play Beatles and Rolling Stones songs and do it well. I should be able to do that, right? Because chances are most of these players grew up listening to that stuff, but they are playing in a specific genre where they have to do things a little bit differently. They have to play more technical and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, with bass, again, I would say we had some great trendsetters back in the 70s. And we unfortunately are living in a day and age where, and even probably from the 80s and onwards, it's like the focus in most bands was on the singer and the guitar player, maybe the drummer. Bass players have really taken a step back in more recent years to just part of the band, not soloists, not setting any trends or anything like that, but very, very talented nonetheless. There are a lot of really talented bass players on the planet right now, and a lot of really good young ones. So I'll kind of stop there. And
yeah, well, okay, so bass players, today have a thing that everybody has to do, which is amazing as well. And it is an advancement, is the complexity of a lot of music that's played these days. Like I say, especially in deathcore, extreme metal and whatnot.
Oh yeah, for
To
sure.
go up there and watch these guys, the things they have to remember, I think, is double what they had to remember in the old days, even on a prog album, right? Just the number of parts and the craziness that way. And one we saw together recently, over a year ago now. But imagine, remember what it was like seeing David Pastorius with
Pat
Pat
Travers.
Travers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like unbelievable, right? But the point I guess I want to make is that, people will put a guy like that down and say, oh, he plays too much. He doesn't have the soul of Ian Hill, right? Or whatever, right? If you want to go real, if you want to go Cliff Williams, Ian Hill, Roger Glover, or whatever, right? Where their job in the band was to be the anchor of the thing. And we over romanticize that whole anchoring thing, I think, too. And we say, oh, they were they were perfect. They were rock steady. They did what the song needed. We're back to that again, right? And
Yeah.
again, had they been allowed or did some other little things in there, a whole bunch of people would say, well, that's clearly better. That's more interesting, right? But again, I think I want to drive home the point that you don't have to put down a guy like David Pastorius, because fact of the matter is, he you can reverse engineer those simple guys, but those simple guys can't engineer forward and be, you can't go to Gene Simmons and say, I want you to, David's got the flu. Go play with Pat Travers. And by the way, play everything he plays. Right.
Yeah.
He's not going to be able to do it. Right. So again, it gets back to objective versus subjective. And even on bass, there were guys breaking records, doing amazing things, inspiring, hundreds of bass players who eventually got famous. Geddy Lee is inspiring those guys, right? John Paul Jones is inspiring those guys to be even bigger musicians than the originals, right? Bigger and arguably better kind of thing. So yeah, they're there making amazing art. I guess the last thing I want to mention on bass players is picking versus playing with your fingers, right? I mean,
oh, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's so it's obvious, and I like your point. I mean, that was really interesting about the whole idea that bass is simpler than guitar, which seems to be, in terms of advancement of acrobatic ability. Drum seems to be, like you say, it's interesting that there seems to be even more crazy impressiveness that you can get out of a drum set. I suppose it's because there's slightly more technology that you can apply to a drum set, and then less on a guitar, and then even less on a bass. You really don't get that. So the bass is more of a closed shop, I guess, right?
Yeah.
It's those two hands and those four strings and
Four
those
strings.
and those frets.
Or in some instances more strings, right? Because they do have all these ridiculous basses now. One of the things we didn't really talk about and touch on that I just thought about too, especially when it comes to modern bass playing and the role of the modern bass player. A lot of more modern productions, especially in metal, and you mentioned extreme metal before, Martin. How many times do you listen to metal albums, death metal albums, black metal albums, and there's a bass player on there, you can't hear him at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a crazy thing where it's the articulation of what's on the bass, right? So sometimes you get a bass sound where the band agrees and the producer has the opinion that we just want to hear the essence of bass, but we don't want to hear the notes, right? The clackiness of a Steve Harris.
The notes are just following the riffs, the guitar riffs, and they're non-distinct. You don't hear them. Where if you go back, I mean, how many times you go listen to an old Yes album, a Rush album, a Black Sabbath album, a Led Zeppelin album, you hear those guys. You hear them doing all sorts of things, right? They're very prevalent in the mix. They're not buried at all. And nowadays, that's again another reason why maybe people don't think of bass players, because their personality is not really coming out. They're just kind of there, right? They're just anchoring or doing whatever it is they're doing. They're following the riffs. So,
well, speaking of personality, my next category is singers, and how does this all apply to singers? And I think it's quite interesting that this whole argument doesn't apply to singers. This whole thing about breaking records and being surpassed as a singer, because now you're down to just that guy's voice, right? That guy or gal's voice. It's literally even more of a closed shop, right? And it's more about personality. So we don't really talk about singers this way. I mean, the only kind of record breaking that we sort of talk about a little bit is, oh, Ian Gillan introduces the scream, and Robert Plant had an amazing shrieky voice, and Rob Halford had a technical voice, and Ronnie James Dio had this other voice that you could really notice the singing ability and stuff. But there are so many amazing singers out there in the world that we will worship the old gods. You know, the old gods cannot be surpassed because it literally is so personable. It's about their personality. It's often about the guy who wrote the lyrics as well, who is the same guy singing. And basically, so a voice has personality. That's just the physical thing. There's singing ability, there's lyrics, there's frontman. It's all wrapped up in this thing about a personality. So it's almost like we don't have this argument. And the extreme version of this, which is kind of interesting, is we put up with terrible singing just to have the old gods, right? Yeah. So we will we literally, you know, this is probably not an exaggeration, but we happily listen to terrible singing more than half the time, simply because that personality and that legend of the old gods is way more important to us than great singing, because great singing is absolutely dime a dozen with all the, you know, you think of all these talent shows, the Masked Singer and all that, and America's Got Talent and all that. So we know there are amazing singers out there, but because this is a department that is so much about that person, it's a non-argument kind of thing. Oh, I'll just show my props here. I took up my three tremors. Remember when three tremors almost happened? Jeff Tate, Bruce Dickinson, Rob Halford, right? This whole idea, right? So yeah, I mean, we love these guys. They were great singers. They could sing high and all that stuff. But also they were absolute personalities. They were the front man. They were writing lyrics and all that sort of stuff. They were thinking. And so that's all important here as well. So yeah, singing, way more of a subjective thing, with those two little departments that are also interesting to talk about. How great is the voice and how great is the singing ability as well?
Yeah, and I like your point about how we put up with subpar vocals from our legends just because it has to be the legend. So, like one thing that instantly came to mind, I'll use the Kansas scenario. So everybody loves Steve Walsh, right? Of course, he's the voice of Kansas, always has been. But since the early '80s, Steve's voice was shot. But we dealt with him going out there, doing what he was doing and not sounding very good, and only agreeing to sing the same set of songs because that's all he could tackle anymore, right? But then Steve leaves and retires, and they bring in a guy, Ronnie Platt, who now, and he doesn't necessarily sound just like Steve, but he can do the Steve stuff. But now Ronnie can sing every single song in their catalog without issue. But so many people won't accept this new version of Kansas because Steve is there. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like, and I've heard many people say that, you know, I will go see, I went to see Kansas with Steve Walsh so many times, even though he didn't sound great, but it was just up there. And there are on the other end of the coin, people stopped going to see Kansas because Steve's vocals were so bad, but yet they won't go to see the current version of the band with a guy who can sing all their favorites just because it's not Steve anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. How much is it the voice of those lyrics? How much is, you know, that being what matters in this whole Geddy and Alex going out playing live again thing? It's like I said in my little piece, it's I personally would rather they make albums and have Geddy sound great rather than watch that degradation of the voice as he gets older and watch him struggle, right? So I couldn't care less whether they played live. I would love to see records. Records is what matters.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
And you know, the other interesting thing I think is that can you call it Rush or whatever? The neat thing is Geddy's had such a super interesting and thoughtful and varied life that I would love to see Geddy write lyrics, right? So, I think you could call it Rush and have Geddy and Alex in some sort of combination collaborate on the lyrics, keep that house totally closed. So lyrics is super important in all this as well. But yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, because singing, in that chart from drums through to guitar through to bass through to voice, I mean, you're really down to you know can you sing, can you not sing? It's not that exciting whether someone can sing amazing. And I do love talking about that idea of voices I don't particularly like, but those people with those voices that I think are kind of crappy can sing amazing with them, right? So to me, they're two different things, right?
Yeah.
One, you've got a really interesting voice, and two, Kiss is such a great example of that, right? You've got three great singers in that band, and then you've got Ace, who's maybe not quite so accurate, but he's also got a great voice. So you've actually got four really interesting voices in that band, and I think you got three pretty darn good singers in that band.
Yeah. Yeah. I would argue that Peter was probably the underrated gem of that band as far as vocals go. I always loved Peter's singing.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you brought up another interesting point early on too, where you talked about those kind of the originals, right? So you mentioned, Gillan and Dio and Plant and Jagger and Tate and Halford and all those guys, right? And we've had them all in the spotlight for so many years that I think we're at a point now where how many like original new singers, young singers come out that sound like themselves and sound completely different? Because I see a lot of people arguing that all these new singers that pop up, this one sounds like Halford, this one sounds like Gillan, this one sounds like Dio, this one sounds like Coverdale, this one sounds like this person, that person, that person, and this one sounds like Paul Rodgers, right? And all of a sudden, all we have are imitators, right? I see that argument a lot, that technically they may be great singers, but they're trying to sound like someone else. Like, when are we going to get someone who's going to have a totally unique singing style that we will look at and say, that's unique, that's special, just like all those other favorites that we have from the last 50 years were also unique and special.
Yeah, or they will correct and engineer all of the imperfections out of it in the production process that without knowing it, they might have had a personality, but you've actually just removed all that personality from it by making the whole thing perfect, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look back at Gary Cherone when he joined Van Halen, right? It's like, Gary Cherone, we would probably all agree that on those early Extreme albums, he had a total personality. He sounded unique. And then all of a sudden they do that Van Halen album, and it's like in the studio, they made him, sound as close to Sammy as you possibly can. And all of a sudden, what we really wanted to hear that we hope would be so special about that Van Halen album wasn't really all that special at all, right? So you had kind of subpar songs and a guy just trying to sound like Sammy. I'm sure Gary looks back on that period and thinks, well, I wish that would have turned out a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, how about on to guitar players, shall we? So, we've been lucky that we've had, at the start of the whole rock and roll circus back in the 60s, we had a lot of guys who got in there early, who were originators, who did some really, really special things and got, notarized for it. The Eric Claptons, the Jimmy Pages, the Jeff Becks, the Duane Allmans, the Paul Kossoffs, the Ace Frehleys, right? Then, Pete Townsend, all these guys, Keith Richards, all these dudes that kind of set the bar at the time. And then along came a guy named Jimi Hendrix, who broke the bar. So your first record breaker, Martin, technically was Jimi Hendrix. It's pretty early on, though. So I think before Jimmy, I would argue that most people thought that the great guitar player in the world, that kind of guitar god, was Eric Clapton. I'd argue, as much as I love a lot of the early Clapton stuff, I think if we look back in time now, we've got a lot of players who can do the Clapton thing and have for many, many years. So it's because I think we were living in a time where guitar solos and guitar oriented music really was in its infancy. I think that's one of the main, and again, no disrespect to Eric Clapton. I dig him. I think a lot of what he did was legendary, But I think looking back, was it all that monumental? And maybe that's why when Hendrix came along, all of a sudden it was like, wow, this is completely different. So, Hendrix totally changed the game. I would also argue that Jeff Beck should get a lot of credit too. Maybe from that time period, number two to Hendrix should have been Beck. Beck has always been a trailblazer, in my opinion. But then, you've got in the wake of Hendrix, right? And all he was doing feedback and effects and, playing lefty and bluesy, funky, rock, psychedelic music, blah, 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 incorporating all these styles and whatnot, the showmanship, the whole thing. Then you got like guys like Robin Trower and Frank Marino who came in the wake of Hendrix and basically took a lot of influence there, but did their own thing. I never thought either one guy was a Hendrix clone. You had a lot of guys coming up in the 70s, right? You got people like Michael Schenker and Uli Roth coming out of the Scorpions and UFO. You got a guy like Richie Blackmore, right, who also, along with Tony Iommi, known as a riff guy, but Blackmore, an excellent soloist as well. And then along comes a guy, Eddie Van Halen, who basically just sets the world on fire. Technical playing, utilizing new tricks and things, doing things with a whammy bar that nobody had heard before, even taking what Hendrix was doing to another level, doing this whole tapping thing, right, which was being done on a smaller scale, but now he made it a big part of his repertoire. Working in the studio with a producer who could totally make his guitar sound truly massive. And then, all of a sudden now the bar has been set even higher. And kind of like what we had with Hendrix, but I think even more so at this point, now you had all these young players who were taking what Van Halen was doing, utilizing all the new technology of the time, and you had this whole wave of clones, of Eddie clones, who could do anything he could do, maybe not with as much personality, but, technically speaking, play any of that kind of stuff. And then going from there. And I'd also argue a guy like Steve Vai probably learned a ton from Eddie and then took it to other places as well. Because I think, for me, when I look at like what Steve Vai has done, it's just absolutely mind-blowing. And no disrespect to Eddie, because again, he was the legend, he was the guy, the trailblazer, but Steve Vai has been doing stuff that's just like, to me, mind-blowing. But Eddie, to his credit, was able to do all of these amazing things within amazing albums and amazing songs that resonated with millions and millions and millions of people. And I think when it comes to guitar playing, that's the thing, because there's a reason why 100 million people have bought Van Halen albums over the years, and maybe 50,000 have bought a Mike Varney Shrapnel Records solo album by Tony McAlpine or Vinnie Moore. As great as those are, right? It's because you're able to include this amazing artistry within songs that are accessible, that resonate with people. So there's that whole thing. And we saw that in the 80s. We saw all of these guitar shredders coming out. Yngwie probably started that whole craze. These guitar albums that are just all about soloing and shredding, and Vinnie Moore, Tony McAlpine, Yngwie Malmsteen, the list goes on and on and on, Jason Becker and Marty Friedman and all these guys. And for a number of years, that became kind of the in thing. And then Vai came out with his solo albums. So Joe Satriani was selling all sorts of records like that. But that was pretty fleeting. But and then there was the whole competition thing in the 80s where, who's better? All the guitar magazines, who's better? Is Vai better than Van Halen? Is Satriani better than Vai? Is Yngwie better than this person? Warren DeMartini and George Lynch, where do they fit in? What can they do? What can they not do? And now today, if we fast forward all these years later, I see, Martin, there's guys like Guthrie Govan, right? And there's guys like Matteo Mancuso and lots of younger shredders who are playing stuff that we've never seen before. And when we talk about YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, you can go anywhere on the internet and see playing from 15-year-olds that will blow your mind, that probably technically surpass anything we've ever seen before. And it's an alarming rate how much you'll see players like this. So I think this whole sports, like who can be better faster, is all the rage right now when it comes to guitar playing. But to go back to what we talked about before in the Van Halen thing, it's like That's great. They're technically, they have surpassed Vi and Van Halen and Satriani and all those guys, but can they write a song? Can they harness all of that talent in something that will grab a hold of the listener and say, wow, that's a great song. And that person's an amazing player. Not just that person's an amazing player. That was great to watch that feat of gymnastics for 5 minutes, but 10 minutes from now, you won't even remember who that person is again, other than, oh yeah, I did watch some kid on YouTube. And that was pretty mind blowing. But until they apply it, that's the thing. How do you apply this going
That's
forward?
a great point, because I think so. Yes, the industry is not set up anymore that whether they wrote a
Right.
bunch of songs, we're even going to know about it, because there's just so much competition. But I think what I want to argue is the anti-snob thing, where you can listen to a 15-year-old kid do 2.5 minutes of noodling, right? And there is some beautiful, beautiful music in what they're doing. They can make amazing, amazing art, but it happens to be a guitar solo on TikTok. It's not a guitar solo in a song on a diamond album by a band
Right.
who's been around for 50 years. It's just a whole, it's almost like a completely different product, right? And the other point I want to make is again this anti-snob thing, that because even when Led Zeppelin came out, it's like, well, they can't really play the blues as legitimately as the old blues artists from the 40s and 50s. And then, oh well, Joe Bonamassa can't play the blues as good as Gary Moore could, or Gary Moore can't play the blues as good as Led Zeppelin could, right? And on and on and on. And I just rankle that when like an old school music snob will say that a 15-year-old kid can't have a blues feel that is as soulful as the original blues thing. Obviously the life experience isn't there, and it's a whole different time and all that kind of stuff, but on the actual evidence of those fingers on those frets and stuff, it's like, yes, it can be amazingly soulful and tasteful, and better blues licks and better blues soloing than on the top 10 blues albums of all time. Just like that, on a dime, no problem. A TikTok video and then it's gone, right? So the art can be as amazing. But yeah, it's and yeah, we have to give credit again. It's not, it's, there is record breaking in guitar, but the fact of the matter is the old gods cannot be surpassed when they've built for themselves an absolute personality. And we know the 20 guys that you would think of first who absolutely have a personality that they put together, a makeup, a thing they did on the guitar that was that extra little bit of art on the guitar. But you can make art on the guitar now as a 15-year-old kid, and it's just as good as the old art.
Yeah, I mean, not to bring up the age thing, but was anybody arguing at however old Eric Clapton was in the Blues Breakers in the mid 60s? What was he, 20, 21 years old? Was anybody arguing that he couldn't play the blues? Well, nobody questioned it,
Yeah.
right? So why can't a 15 or 18-year-old kid today, who has, since they were 5 years old, have been listening to the blues and playing the blues on guitar, or even whatever age, right? Why all of a sudden are they not able to do it? And there's no way they can understand the blues, but yet back in the day, we didn't question any of those young guys back then, right? Because they were young then too, right? We never questioned it, but now we question it, right? Because they're not that person, right?
Yeah.
It's like, because again, we're romanticizing those originals as, well, it was okay when they did it, but it's not okay if someone does it today. Because I hear that about like Joe Bonamassa all the time. Joe Bonamassa is now in his mid 40s. I remember when he first came up and he played in Bloodline, and he was a young kid and whatever. And, Joe Bonamassa has been around blues players his whole life. Uh, so why can't he be a true blues player, but yet we don't question any of these other guys? And Joe is older now than what I'm talking about, when Clapton and when Beck and when Page and all those guys were young blues players on the scene in the early 60s, right? We didn't question that, but we question them all today, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not those legends that we hold so high.
That's funny. That's a whole nother show. Like, do you ever get shocked where you go, where you're, some of your old absolute heroes, you think they're so wise and the wisdom in these lyrics and the things they talked about and they were gods, right? And then you go, wow, they made that album when they were 21 years old, right? And you go, geez, but they were older than you, at the time, right? So,
Yeah.
so that's kind of the interesting thing, right? So,
Yeah.
anyways, okay, I'll move on to the last one. Because yeah, it's an interesting discussion, but it's a little nebulous. I mean, moving on to the idea of bands, um, I almost feel like you put bands in the same categories as singers. There's so much of a package there that you've put together that is all about personality. There's lyrics, there's 4 or 5 players, there's album covers, there's the live shows, there's being a front man, there's real people involved, a bunch of them, and the way they interact with each other. So, can the old gods be surpassed when you are a band, sort of thing? you know, again, I think it's an interesting yes or no, because I always compare to Led Zeppelin, and I always think back to things. Well, I'll put it this way. Here's 2 examples that always stick in my head, right? Aerosmith Rocks versus Led Zeppelin Presence, and even something like Sad Wings of Destiny versus Rainbow Rising, right? So the Presence example is, you just listen to Rocks as a kid. Maybe it's because you're a kid and you want your own bands or whatever, but you go, this clearly is better in every single department at playing at their exact same game than Led Zeppelin, right? So is this better than Led Zeppelin? It's like, well, the old snobs are going to say, no, it's Led Zeppelin. You can't beat Led Zeppelin, right? And then the young kids will come up and say, no, these guys are kicking your ass, right? This everything about what they're doing on Aerosmith Rocks is just out Zeppelin in every way, right? Kind of thing.
Especially at that time, right?
Yep. So we're in 1976, and then it's driven, that point is driven even more when you go. So Rainbow Rising happens, and I can't remember what order it's in, but whatever. They're both 76 albums. Rainbow Rising happens, and you go, wow, this is really impressive. This is basically like Deep Purple, right? And then all of a sudden you listen to Sad Wings of Destiny, and you go, okay, so this feels like it's 5 years ahead of Rainbow Rising already. I mean, everything that's going on here is like super intelligent and men's metal, and even this singer in certain ways is better than that singer. Or let's say the technicality of the range of his voice is better, right? So we'll confine it to voice. But yeah, so I took out some props. Kiss is always hugely in this debate, how we constantly still talk about Kiss all the time. There's some Deep Purple in Rock, and there's my Cream, signed by, missing Eric, but we got Jack Bruce and Ginger on that one, right? But Cream is such a perfect example of that as well, where we talk about those individual players, but then we also talk about just the band itself and how the songs are kind of caveman-y, right? Are they in there inventing metal and all this? Well, not really, and blah blah blah. But yeah, Kiss is such a perfect example where no, there's so much wrapped up in the personality of that band. And that band, honestly, I guess it's one of the ones where people didn't really even try to copy them, and not because it was hard to copy them, almost because it was too easy to copy them, right? So you didn't get bands that were as straightforward as Kiss, essentially, because you probably thought you would get ridiculed for that, right? So it's a little different in the situation, but yeah. So what was our title? Can the old legends be surpassed, right? So I guess in the band situation, I'll stick that one, like I say, in the singer situation, where it's so much about personality. It's not about breaking records, and it's not particularly about, there's so much complexity to it, and subjectivity about it, that you don't really talk about it in the way that someone broke the record on that old band. You just get other bands.
Yeah, and I'll kind of end this on a note, and going back to a comment you made on, I think, the previous episode. So you talked about how, we'll use Black Sabbath as an example here. You talked about how bands that came in the wake of Black Sabbath essentially were even doing better at being Black Sabbath than Black Sabbath was. And I'll agree with you to an extent that post Mob Rules going forward, you had bands like Trouble and Cathedral, St. Vitus. There's a whole bunch more. We can go on and on talking about them all, and even up to this day, who have done the Black Sabbath thing better than Black Sabbath post Mob Rules. You could arguably say that. You know,
yeah, that's right. I forgot about that example. So again, and to take that step even further, think of the massive doom industry that started in about 1995 and has just continued to grow, right?
Yeah.
So you've got so if you're a young kid nowadays, you kind of don't need your Black Sabbath, because you could spend all of whatever you're going to allot to music listening time and just stick in the doom genre and have enough to listen to for the rest of your life. And you could say, you know, they've built on the legacy of Sabbath and done a better job of it. And yes, I remember feeling that way about at specific magic moments on Cathedral albums or Trouble albums or whatever. And you go, wow, they've on a really artistic level captured the essence of Sabbath and done this individual thing with it that's even better, sort of thing. But yeah, you can have rote copyists who you're not going to feel that same thing about. But yeah, it's a complicated thing. But yeah, I guess the point we want to make is we should laud these guys for personality, but we shouldn't over romanticize them for technicality ever. Right.
Nothing wrong with loving the old legends, right? We all do. But yeah, cool. Well, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, I'm sure we're going to get lots of comments down below, agreeing or disagreeing, and that's fine, right? Like, and in no way, shape, or form are we putting any of the old legends down, because we love them. But I think Martin and I both embrace the whole idea that the legends weren't the only one who can do all these things great. Right. And maybe deep down inside there, they weren't the greatest at them, but they were the first. That's why we love them so much. And there's nothing wrong with that. So anyway, thanks for joining, everybody. Martin, you want to give everybody a little updates on what's happening with you over on Contrarians and podcasts and books and things?
Yeah, so there's always Contrarians shows, and there's always the the weekly album cover one and a bunch of Dark Horse episodes and all that sort of stuff. And I have weekly, again, my History in 5 Songs audio podcast, and I just went through a second batch of my favorite top 10 albums. So Shadow Top 5, I called it, because, you know, we love music so much. There's probably 30 albums that on any given day we can put in our top 10, right? But I went through 5 more albums, every single song on them, and I looked for the break sections, and describe what kind of break it was, and do they do breaks a lot? Do they not do breaks a lot? So that follows up the episode on choruses and pre-choruses. And yeah, martinpopoff.com for all the books. This time of year, if people are ordering books, like, let me know for sure if I'm to sign this to you or to sign, because I'll sign whatever anybody wants on the books. If it's a gift for somebody for Christmas or whatever, I have a lot of stress this time of year because of that, because I get orders from women quite often at this time of year, right? And I'm suspecting it's not for them, but you email them and they don't email you back, and you don't know what to do. And I swear to God, 30 times a year, every single year for the last 20 years, my hand is hovering over that page going, do I sign this to Linda or not? Right. And I'm going, well, it's Rush. It's not Merciful Fate. So it's Rush. It might be for Linda.
Or it might not.
It says on my site that I'm going to sign it to you. I have asked you, I've emailed you. If I don't sign it to you, are you going to be ticked off at that if I leave it unpersonalized? So I have this long, complicated message I send people and I don't get an answer back. And yeah, it's really a pain. And then once in a while, I get eventually 2 weeks later, Linda will write back and say, you were supposed to sign it to Bart. It's like, well,
if you don't tell me, what am I supposed to do?
How do I know who Bart is? Right. And then you're in the, I guess maybe I should recognize that name because I did get 2 orders from Bart 2 years ago. And maybe Bart thinks I know who he is and he's using Linda's PayPal. And so yes, if you're ordering books, I'll sign whatever you want to whoever you want. Just let me know.
Very important. It seems simple to most people, but yeah, it's. All right, what do we got going on here on the channel? Of course, just a couple hours, Ken Golden will be taking Martin's seat in Zoom, and we'll be doing the professor's picks, so stay tuned for that for its new release day. It is Friday. And we've got the UK connection coming up tomorrow, and then we're going to do another AOR melodic rock show, and then on Sunday is ranking the albums, so stay tuned for that as well. And visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as it posts. And please do hit the like button before you leave. Make sure you go visit Martin's links as well, and we'll see you right back here very soon on the Funhouse. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.